It's raining. Why couldn't I have had this atmospheric rain when I was doing my Blade Runner review? Well, hello, chaps and chapettes. It's been over a month since my last video, for which I apologise. The prep and preview for Edinburgh has kind of been taking up quite a lot of my time. But thankfully it went well, and I can get on now with doing some of the videos I meant to catch up on all this time. Well, in the interests of time, I don't think I'm going to be able to devote one video to each of the films currently left on my 5 significant films list, but I do want to give all of them the time they deserve, so I'm going to do all of them in one big bumper video in a sort of as quick fire away as I can. So, the next film on my list that I was going to review was the 1938 film The Adventures of Robin Hood. Now, a plot summary of this would probably follow the same general beats that most of the Robin Hood films you've ever seen follow. Robin Hood returns from the Holy Land, he finds a Britain that is overrun with tyranny, he runs off to the forest, becomes an outlaw, wins the hand of Maid Marian, defeats the bad guys, and everyone lives happily ever after. I think as cheesy and as Hollywood as this interpretation of Robin Hood is, and it is very cheesy in Hollywood, I think, weirdly enough, it scores over so many of the other Robin Hoods I've seen, just simply because, while you are very much aware that this is not at all true to the setting or time period, you don't really mind because it's so very much true to itself. I mean, the resonance for me was, it was quite possibly one of, if not the first film I ever remember watching. And the fact that it was made in 1938 really serves to heighten the fact that this is a really large-scale film they've got here. The sets for the castle and the fields and the archery tournament and all of this stuff must have cost an absolute fortune then. I'm not even sure you could probably do it now. I mean, of course you could do it, but the point of the matter was, it was all practical. There was nothing that was CGI or computer imposed. It was all practical effects and practical sets, which is crazy when you have a look at it. The reason I keep going back to this film, I think, is it's, for me, one of the best, most archetypal ways you can tell a well-known story, hit all the right beats, and not at any point lose your credibility, even though what you're doing is completely fantastical. Also, Basil Rathbone and Errol Flynn do manage to put into celluloid history one of, I think, the best sword fights ever choreographed, ever made, bar none. The only one that even comes close to this is Princess Bride. Also, in conclusion, I should mention that this film has some of the biggest names in Hollywood at the time. Errol Flynn, Olivia de Havilland, Claude Rains, Basil Rathbone. So many people. Again, like these days, it would be an absolute A-list blockbuster summer film. So yeah, not the most accurate or realistic retelling of the Robin Hood story, but I think, weirdly enough, probably one of the most unpretentious ones. If there is a memorable quote from this film, it's probably between Robin Hood and Sir Guy in their last pitched battle together, which is just so indicative of the time and style, but it's very pantomimish in some ways. It's, did I upset your plans? You've come to Nottingham once too often. When this is over, my friend, there'll be no need for me to come again. It's all so earnest, but with a great sense of fun about it. From one legend to another. The next film on my list is the John Boorman film from 1981, Excalibur. I've realised quite a lot of what I've said about Robin Hood can be applied to this film. However, the plot summary is essentially, it's the story of the rise and fall of King Arthur. I remember the first time I saw this film, I was about 5 or 6, and it was probably wholly inappropriate for me at the time, and a lot of it did go over my head. However, what did stick with me was the consummate storytelling, the fantastic sets and armour, and also an absolutely standout performance by Nicole Williamson as Merlin. Often imitated, never equalled. I suppose having seen this film at such a young age as I did, one of the things that resonates for me is simply the fact that I was able to see it. I was allowed by my dad to watch this film, something that was advanced and dealt with concepts I hadn't even really been introduced to yet. And yet, it was an absolutely cracking story. It was full of adventure, but also pathos, and I think maybe it was one of the first stories I read that really dealt with flawed characters. Like, it deals with Arthur's brashness as a young man and how he has to overcome this to be the wise king that he is destined to be. And it deals with Lancelot's love for Guinevere and how that is ultimately his undoing. And how, while Morgana and Mordred are painted as the villains of the piece, they are only doing what they're doing because they feel that they are justified in doing what they're doing. They're not some pantomime moustache-twirling villains. They've actually got quite complex motives. I think in a way that's kind of why I keep going back to it. It's a story about fantastical people who have entirely relatable human problems. Also, the amount of British talented actors in this film is nothing short of obscene. There could have been people who were quite famous at the time, like Helen Mirren and Nicol Williamson, and people who latterly went on to be very famous people in their own right. People like Gabriel Byrne, Liam Neeson, Patrick Stewart, people you've heard of. So in conclusion, much like Robin Hood, maybe not the most accurate retelling of the story, but certainly one that is the most true to itself and entertaining. For the memorable quotes for this film, I could try butchering the charm of making, but I won't do that. I'll instead go with... There's a quote from Merlin that says, "I have walked my way since the beginning of time. Sometimes I give, sometimes I take. It is mine to know which and where." Looking at the next one on my list, I've just realised that 3 of the 5 films I've chosen for this list came out within 18 months of each other. I don't know what that says, but maybe I'm just a child of the 80s. The next film on my list is Tron, and I've discovered it's really difficult to adequately plot summarise this film, but here goes. It's about Kevin Flynn, this computer genius who is trying to expose the company he used to work at for stealing his ideas, falling foul of a malevolent AI who digitizes him into the computer, wherein he starts interacting with all of the programs in there and basically has to run a kind of gauntlet in order to both do what he got in there to do, which is expose the company, and get home again. It's a really imaginative, creative story. I really cannot imagine how they would have sold that to the Disney execs when they were first pitching this film. But it's obviously based a lot on the fact that in the 1980s people didn't really understand what computers were or what they entailed or how they interacted with each other, but the idea that you could digitize somebody, all the information that makes them up, and then put them into a computer world where they could interact with all the things in the computer world, which kind of are like an interesting mirror of the programmers and the humans that had created them, is a really interesting concept. Certainly one that you wouldn't quite expect from a Walt Disney film. Of course, one of the things you've got to talk about with Tron is the visuals. Ironically enough, I find that the scenes that take place in the real world look more dated than the scenes that take place inside the computer. Maybe it's just the fantastical nature of it, but the design, while it is kind of 80s and blocky, you buy it. Because in some ways it just seems right that that would be what the inside of a computer, especially the inside of a computer in the 80s, would look like. I suppose one of the reasons I keep going back to it is that living in a world now where computers are kind of de rigueur, like there's 3 in this room, when this film was released, the idea that you would have a computer in your home was something of a weird idea. And yet it didn't go down the route of computers are sinister and weird and technology is evil. It kind of went down the route of, it's a reflection of us. The technology we create is, in a big way, a reflection of ourselves. While you can project all of these highfalutin concepts on top of it, the reason why I keep going back to it year after year is just because it's a really satisfying action-adventure story. And while there is undoubtedly a load of really innovative and creative eye candy, and the special effects were absolutely cutting edge for the time, you almost don't notice them because they're all in service of the story. You know, there's no big sweeping panoramas that don't need to be there. There's no music videos in the middle of it for the sake of there being music videos in the sake of the middle of it. There is an awful lot to Tron, but none of it is superfluous. Partially, I guess, because even the tiniest bit of rotoscopic animation would have cost them a fortune. So, in conclusion, Tron is a really nice piece of 80s nostalgia with good characters, good plot, an original storyline, innovative use of technology. It's definitely something worth going back to. And my favourite quote from it probably is, "Seems like you guys keep doing what it seems you're supposed to be doing. I hate to break it to you, but that's just how it works out in the real world as well." And finally, the last film on my list is the 1979 film The Life of Brian. What can I say about The Life of Brian that hasn't already been said? The plot, insofar as there is one, surrounds a Jew in the time of Jesus and his misadventures surrounding a possibly well-known biblical story. But really and truly, it is just Monty Python at their finest doing what they do best, which is taking Britain in the modern day and putting it into a different context and somehow extracting comedy gold out of it. I don't think I actually recall the first time I saw this film, but I do know that it was my introduction to Monty Python in general, and wow, what an introduction. I seem to remember watching it shortly after I'd seen the film Ben-Hur, and seeing something that was in, you know, vaguely the same kind of setting, but completely different in terms of tone and story and pretty much everything else. I got the sort of sense that this might be something of a send-up of that particular type of film. I didn't know that there had been an awful lot of controversy surrounding this film. I mean, I didn't think from the get-go that they were taking the piss out of Jesus or the biblical story or anything like that. What I thought was they were taking the piss rather effectively, in my opinion, of the human foibles and failings surrounding it. Like the example of, you know, there's the Sermon on the Mount and the people at the back can't hear, so they hear "Blessed are the cheesemakers," you know, or the bit where they're all going to stone Matthias to death, only to realise that actually it's all women in the front with false beard because they want to go to the stoning and they can't because they're women. This is one of those films where I think if you came to it now, having never seen it before and not knowing anything about Python, you might be forgiven for thinking that they've just strung a whole load of old quotes together and made a film out of it. I think the reason I go back to it so often, aside from it is just that funny, is that you can't be a comedian, I might even go so far as to say in the English-speaking world these days, and not at least recognise the relevance of Monty Python as being one of your antecedents. It is easily one of the best comedy films of all time. It does exactly what it sets out to do and exceeds expectations in all fields. It also has one of the most annoyingly catchy ending songs of all time, and has kind of entered the collective unconscious, really. And it really did break new grounds in terms of parody and satire, grounds that I think very much needed to be broken. As for memorable quotes, well, where the hell to start? I think I'll have to go for my personal favourite though, which is, "He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy." Thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry there was so much of a wait and that this was rather more truncated than I had originally intended it to be. I promise there will not be as big a gap between this and my next video. In terms of who to tag for this, I'm hard-pressed to think of anyone who hasn't done it yet, but alright. My father, BikerMiker55, because he hasn't made a video in far too long. Jason Phelps, as he's just started making videos, and I would be very much interested to hear what 5 significant films he would like to talk about. And my friend Nicole, Duessa2000. I haven't seen you on the YouTubes for far too long. Well, I look forward to seeing what the 3 of you make of that, and for the rest of you, Until next time, chaps and chapettes.